As you know, my name is Tim Miller, and joining me today I have Jenna Teely, one of our client managers. Jenna, welcome along to the presentation today.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me here, and welcome everyone.
So what Jenna's going to do is she'll work through with me some of the contribution issues and some of the questions as they arise. So please use the Q&A box with regards to the questions that you might have. I'm really hoping that today is a good engagement presentation for you because there's a lot happening in this contribution space. So what I hope to get out of the presentation for yourselves, predominantly from this presentation today, is how the contribution and transfer balance caps are indexed. And there's some really interesting stuff going on with the recession at the moment, and as a result of COVID-19, and that's going to have, I think, a fairly significant impact on our contribution caps and how things work over the next couple of years. Part of that's going to be who qualifies for the bring forward rules and how those rules work. Now, I was pretty hopeful that by the time that this presentation came around that the Senate had got their act together and were providing us with some information, or at least with some final legislation on the bring forward rules, but we're still sitting in Senate. So we're going to assume, or I'm going to present on the assumption that the bring forward age limit increases to 67, but we do have to be mindful that currently it's 65, so we've got a little bit of an anomaly there. And then I really want to finish and touch on some of how the contribution strategies, particularly in line of the movement of the contribution rules up to age 67. So, it's a little bit of that concept of, do we wait or do we contribute now? And I think we want to sort of engage in some of that contribution piece and the timing of contributions as we go. So, as I said, I'm going to start with the indexation rules, then touch on bring forward, then really work our way through what the rules are with the 67 versus the 65 sort of stuff. So let's jump straight into it from an indexation point of view. So there are two, I guess, critical indexation calculations that we need to be mindful of, and the first one is obviously our concessional contribution cap, and the second one is the general transfer balance cap. So these two things for contribution strategy purposes really go hand in hand, because the concessional cap, and I'm going to run through these numbers with you in a little bit more detail in a moment, but the concessional cap really is about what level of deductible contributions can we or our employer put in to the superannuation fund, what level of tax deduction can we claim, and get our entitlement to a tax deduction. So ultimately, where do we sit? Where's our limit sit before we get hit with excess contribution? So the concessional cap sort of just motors along from an indexation point of view, but of course it's linked also to the non-concessional, so it becomes fairly relevant. And then the general transfer balance cap is really, I guess, from an industry point of view, a catch-all cap with regards to the number of things and number of strategies that it impacts. And of course, the general transfer balance cap was primarily introduced as a pension measure, but it actually has links and ramifications to so many parts of the contribution rules that we really need to be able to monitor how it is indexed and when it's indexed, as it will impact the capacity for our clients to make contributions. And of course, what happens with both of these calculations is that the indexation is going to occur when we get our formula, and we actually get some numbers that go over and above our rounding numbers. So I'm going to touch on the rounding numbers, but the 2,500 for concessional caps and 100,000 for the general transfer balance cap. Once our calculations get above 2,500, so get above 27,500 for concessional and 1.7 million for the balance cap, then we finally get our indexation. So, indexation, for those that have been in the industry long enough, it's changed the way that it occurs and the timing and the frequency that it occurs, probably more so since 2007, but it's fairly significant in the way it operates. And look, I did my last presentation on COVID-19 and the impact that has on self-managed superannuation funds. Well, the impact that COVID-19 has had on indexation, to me, is quite staggering. And when you do your research on some of these issues, you can see that it's actually had sort of polar effects on the concessional caps and the average weekly ordinary times earnings versus the general transfer balance cap and CPI. So where we land with indexation is actually going to be fairly significant for us. So if we touch on the concessional cap, our indexation occurs based on average weekly ordinary times earnings. So again, all these stats are all released by the Bureau of Statistics. And what we want to look at is the quarter, the December quarter, immediately prior to the financial year. So in this instance, we're going to be keeping our eye open for December 2020. And what that means, and we divide it by the base quarter, and the base quarter is the quarter immediately prior to these rules all coming into effect from 1 July 17. So that's our December 2016. So what we're looking at is a base factor of 1,533.4, and what we need to target to be able to get an indexation to the concessional contribution cap is 1686. So just, I guess, to formalise that and to show you what I mean, if you got 1686 divided by the 1533, it gives us a factor of 1.100, because the legislation gets pretty specific and it tells us that we have to round to 3 decimal points. But when we then multiply our 25,000 by that rounding factor, it takes us up to 27,500. So what is significant here from an indexation point of view is that the June 2020 awardee figure was 1713.90. So if we look exclusively at that 1713.90, you know, we're well and truly over and above the 1686, and the concessional cap on those sorts of numbers are going to be indexed from next year. But when you do your research into that, the numbers are highly relevant based on a lot of low-income earners actually dropping out of the workforce. So as a direct result of COVID-19, a lot of people on lower incomes have dropped out of the workforce, and so therefore it effectively has overinflated what the weekly ordinary times earnings is. So come December, and November is really the month that we're interested in seeing, you know, if there is not a significant uplift in, say, employment levels between now and then I think we can see that there will be indexation of the concessional contribution cap. However, if you actually go back and do the research of how awardee has moved over probably the last 10 years, then the numbers have moved far more slowly and represent, say, 1% versus, in this instance, what is closer to 4% growth. And so in that instance, you know, we may not have seen the caps being indexed. So it's going to be one of those interesting areas where, due to COVID, it might actually speed up the process of the concessional caps being indexed. But of course, with some level of normality, we may also see that go the other way. Versus the transfer balance cap, and of course that impacts our non-concessional, our bring forward, government co-contributions, spouse contributions, and a number of other measures. That's actually indexed subject to consumer price index. And again, we're using the December quarter numbers, but instead of a WOTI, we're relying on CPI. Now, interestingly, when you looked at March 2020 CPI numbers, the indexation factor was roughly, CPI was 2.2% from March to March. Once we got to the June quarter, then we actually had negative CPI. So it's a CPI across all the weighted groups, which is based on the averages of the 8 capital cities. The average CPI was like negative 1.9%. So we actually saw a situation where our June factor for CPI dropped to 114.4, whereas what we're actually targeting to get an indexation of the transfer balance cap is 116.9. Now these are numbers that I'm throwing around. It's like, okay, why is that all relevant? Well, in the March quarter, we were pretty close with 116.6. So if indexation had have kept tracking at that rate, then we would have seen the transfer balance cap absolutely indexed from 1 July 2021. What we're seeing now is that CPI has dropped down, and when you talk about the average weighting of 8 capital cities, and when you look at lockdowns that have been occurring in Melbourne and to a lesser extent in Sydney, but also when you factor in that some of those CPI things consider travel and other sort of consumables that aren't necessarily being spent on at the moment, then there's this, I guess, an industry fear factor, for want of a better term, that CPI factor is not going to get too much higher than that 114.4 for the December quarter, meaning that we don't have a transfer balance cap indexation occurring from 1 July 2021. So, you know, 116.9 is our target number, but what does all that mean to us? Well, what it actually potentially means is that we're going to have a concessional cap of 27,500 that's going to apply from 1 July 2021. It means we're going to have a non-concessional cap from 1 July 2021 of 110,000 because the non-concessional is 4 times the concessional amount. It means we're going to have a bring forward maximum of $330,000 amount, so over that 3-year period. But it also means we might still have a transfer balance cap of $1.6 million. And so that's, you know, one of those impact items that people are fairly sort of mindful of is what does that mean for the bring forward provisions. And so I guess what I've tried to do is I've tried to project for you what that actually looks like with regards to the bring forward provisions if we don't have indexation of the transfer balance cap. And you know, so these are the numbers basing on a working backwards based on how the legislation is currently written. But clearly, if we've got more than $1.6 million, then we've got no capacity to make any non-concessional contributions. We then have to, and this table is going to start to get crazy. And over the years, as we get indexation, you know, I think you know, we all kind of look for different and better ways as far as transfer balance cap's concerned. But when we're starting to have to subtract 1 year's worth of the non-concessional amount from the transfer balance cap to work out whether we're entitled to the bring forward amounts, we're going to have or create issues for our clients, and we're going to have clients that do the wrong thing. And so we need to be able to help guide them through it. But ultimately, if you've got a client with less than the 1.49 million, between 1.49 and 1.6, then they'd be able to make 1 year's worth of non-concessional. Between 1.38 to 1.49, then they'd be able to make the 220, so utilising 2 years. And less than 1.38 million, then they would have capacity to use the 330,000. So by virtue of negative CPI, what we're actually seeing is currently that number sits at $1.4 million, and we're actually going to see a diminishing value there of what your balance can be to be able to make or to utilise the full bring forward provision. So, you know, that's sort of a watch this space area, because it will impact people who have it in their minds that $1.4 million is the sort of the critical key number. But if we do add CPI to the equation, well, then what we do is we effectively add $100,000 to all of those numbers. And as we can see, we start with the 1.7, and that's our cap for our capacity to make non-concessional contributions. Then we look at 1.5, between 1.59 to 1.7 to be able to make a contribution, between 1.48 to 1.59 for 220, and less than 1.48 million for 330,000. So, you know, these are the numbers that we hope to see, like this table more than the one before. But at the moment, based on what we're seeing, I would think there'd be more inclination that the previous table would be the relevant one. So I just wanted to jump over to Jenna on that one and see whether or not, I know as one of our client managers that we get a lot of questions in regards to the bring forward provisions. Jenna, did you have one of those questions that you received recently that we were talking about?
Yes, certainly, Tim. So we often get the question from clients in regards to the bring forward arrangement and also how to calculate total superannuation balance.
Yeah, look, and it's a really interesting point because using the bring forward provision, a lot of clients and direct clients particularly don't understand how that works.
Correct.
And so, what they're kind of looking at, particularly with total super balance, and I know that this is an industry issue across the board, is that if you're looking just at your self-managed superannuation fund, then you might not be getting a full appreciation for the total superannuation balance. So the clients need to be able to log into MyGov. Now, that MyGov is going to be representative of effectively what's provided via their annual returns. So it's going to be relevant to what's in their accumulation interest, and it's going to be relevant to a modified transfer balance account with regards to pensions. And so we're going to have certain debits and credits removed from there. But ultimately, it's one of those situations, particularly if we see the total super balance amount or drop below the transfer balance cap, drop below 1.4 down to 1.38, then we're going to see clients wanting to look at ways of potentially reducing their balance. And of course, market valuations is a clear way, but if they've got property investments inside their funds, they can always look at what tax liabilities, what additional costs are associated with those various investments to determine if it's going to provide a lower total superannuation balance. But certainly, it's going to be one of those things that what we have in the previous year is going to be very relevant, and people are going to need to keep a close eye on it to be able to determine what the appropriate contribution amount is. The other point I would make with regards to the bring forward amount and the non-concessional limit is that whilst I comment on things like COVID-19, the other thing that's done is dropped market valuations down. So I assume that we would have seen a lot of funds that we administer where the valuation of the assets is lower at 2020 compared to...
have.
Yeah, so lower balances from 2020 to 2019 means that, there potentially is that little bit of cap space in there. So that's how the bring forward stuff's going to potentially look after the 1st of July 2021. And that's really a bit of an introduction piece to, I guess for me, what is critically the new piece of legislation that took effect from 1 July 2020 this year. And what is, look, I won't say it's staggering because many of you have been in the SMSF industry long enough to know that change is inevitable in this space for us, and we're regularly seeing things occur. But if, for example, we see an indexation of the concessional cap from the 1st of July next year, and then an indexation of the transfer balance cap in the 2022 year, then we are going to see changes from a contribution point of view for effectively 5 to 6 straight years with regards to a lot of the measures that have been introduced, plus indexation. And that effectively takes away a lot of the stability within the industry to understand exactly what clients can do. So really what you need to understand is the contribution rules first, and how the contribution rules work, and then how you factor those rules into things such as the bring forward provisions. And it's critical to understand how 67 is the new 65, but what that also means from a strategic point of view. So, as I run through these rules, then I want to start to build into the sort of the nitty-gritty strategy type situations and look at a couple of examples to work out sort of what's going to be available for our clients. So what we know is up until 30 June last year, basically you had the rules that applied for somebody from the age of 65 up to the age of 65, how there's no work test, no requirements there. We also knew that the new work test exemption came in from 1 July 2019, which was linked to the total super balance of $300,000. And of course the other one being the downsizer contribution being available from age 65. What is now in law is that the contribution age, from a SIS regulation point of view, the contribution age is now 67. So in effect, individuals don't need to meet the work test prior to age 67, and that's going to impact such measures as the work test exemption, and when will that actually kick in, which is effectively from the 67th year. It won't have an impact on downsizer contributions. Downsizer still applies from age 65, but it is potentially, and right now, an issue with regards to the bring forward rules because we haven't got the amendments through with regards to the income tax law as to what age those rules kick in. So, you know, what 67 does is it provides this window of opportunity, which is really, I guess, a key reason for the webinar today, is that we're in the midst of, I guess, a contribution revolution, for want of a better term, with regards to how we can apply strategies to our clients. And it's a little bit of make hay while the sun shines because, you know, again, if we just go back to 2006, where they introduced through budget night the 1 million cap that took effect from budget night, if we then come forward a further sort of 10 years from that to the 2016 budget, and we saw the super reform changes there, and again a reduction of the concessional or the non-concessional cap to 25 and 100,000 respectively. So it's a matter when we're identifying these opportunities to not think about what might happen in the future, but what opportunities are available now. So the downsizer contribution, for example, if we assume that's here to stay, well, that gives us a capacity at any age beyond 65 to contribute. But more key to all of this is the whole retirement age of 65 still being a fairly significant trigger, and the fact that if somebody can meet a condition of release at 65, retire, but still have the capacity to make contributions and still have the capacity to use all of the various contribution opportunities available to them, and effectively build up their superannuation proceeds. And, you know, many of us use or look at the superannuation life cycle, and we used to kind of talk about up to age 60 would be the accumulation stage, from 60 to 65 the transitioning to retirement stage, and then from 65 plus is the retirement stage. But now with these contribution measures, those things all still apply, but we've got the capacity to start to I guess, make additional proceed payments into superannuation once we've met a condition of release. And whilst I'll chat about it in a moment, you know, our good old recontribution strategy, it's certainly alive and kicking, and it's certainly got a new lease of life with regards to this 67 age limit. And I think they're the sorts of things that we need to be mindful of. Of course, once we get above 67, we've got to then contemplate our work test and what that actually means, in addition to obviously the work test exemption. So the work test exemption is an interesting one because I'll touch on it in a moment from a strategic point of view, but we kind of allude to a lot of self-managed superannuation funds in their current environment having less, or having total superannuation balances less than 300,000. But, you know, if we're talking about individuals who might not be in self-managed super fund and members that are joining SMSFs late, then it's not unrealistic to think that a lot of people don't have amounts lower than that 300. We just like to allude to SMSFs ultimately being the vehicle for those with significant proceeds, and having the capacity to have that $1.6 million plus in super. But clearly there are a lot of people under that sort of balance in the SMSF space, or potentially in the SMSF space. So what is critical then to the strategic side of things is a total superannuation balance, and what that actually means with regards to what various contribution strategies are available to us. So what I want to do now is as we sort of enter the second half of the webinar, is I want to work through how these strategies apply, and certainly I'd love if anybody's got any questions about contribution strategies to certainly shoot them through, and we'll try and work our way through them from a process point of view as well. But what we need to contemplate is that we've got the total superannuation balance, which is clearly going to impact the non-concessional contributions and our capacity to make contributions over and above the transfer balance cap. We've then got the catch-up concessional contributions. That's our $500,000 amount. That is an unindexed amount, and I know that we've got some questions, and I'll come back to those in a moment on the catch-up concessional, but that's an unindexed amount that we have to take into consideration. Then we've got our minor issues with the transfer balance cap, which is accessibility to the government co-contribution and accessibility to the spouse contribution tax offset. And if we've got members that have more than the general transfer balance cap, then their eligibility for government co-contributions disappears. I'm of the school of thought that suggests that if you've got more than $1.6 million, then that additional $500 kicked in by the government is not necessarily here nor there, so we shouldn't be trying to chase after those sorts of smaller amounts. And then, of course, we've now got, because of the changes in the age limit, the 12-month work test exemption and the $300,000. And I think probably what's critical when talking about that is to actually understand the nuance between the work test exemption and the $300,000 total super balance versus the new rules. And that is, from 1 July 2020, basically the age moved from 65 to 67, where the work test was removed. So in effect, for any client that is 66 years of age, then subject to their total superannuation balance, they can make non-concessional contributions. If they then cease, regardless of whether they're working or not, if they work and they continue to work up to and beyond 67, then the work test exemption applies in the year after they cease gainful employment. And in the year after they cease gainful employment, if their total superannuation balance was less than $300,000 at the previous 30 June, then they can make a non-concessional contribution. They can also make concessional contributions as well. But to me, that creates a strategy opportunity for so many SMSF and non-SMSF clients to be able to utilise things such as recontribution strategies. And I say this in a lot of presentations. The government regularly tell us that superannuation is not an estate planning vehicle. But we know when you introduce laws like all of these, the work test exemption, the increasing age to 67, we know that superannuation is ripe for at least taxation planning from an estate planning point of view. And to me, the whole bring forward contribution rules and the work test exemption really provide great opportunities for clients who previously used to have to look at potentially manipulating the retirement definition. Now they've got that capacity once they hit 65 to introduce some of these strategies, and I think it's pretty significant. One of the things that I would say is an issue with regards to the general transfer balance cap and all these various thresholds that apply is the disregarded small fund assets, because that sits in there, and it was legislated obviously at the same time for self-managed superannuation funds. It's relevant for pensions, but where it's problematic is that it was legislated as a dollar amount of $1.6 million. So when the general transfer balance cap is indexed to $1.7 million and people start commencing pensions for $1.7 million, then the segregation rules are still linked to this $1.6 million amount. And whilst the subject of today is not on pensions, it's certainly something to contemplate in certainly a future webinar as to what that's going to look like once we're indexed with regards to segregating member accounts. So it's one to certainly keep our space or our eye nice and tightly on. So look, I want to touch on the contribution strategies and start to work through a few of these rules. So what I want to spend the next few minutes doing is effectively taking a set of circumstances and turning that into multiple contribution strategies, just for you to be able to take away sort of some thought processes to what applies to my clients, what's the best strategy, how does turning 67 impact them, what are the work test issues, what are their actual balances. So the median SMSF balance at 1 July 2018, which is our last lot of ATO statistics, was $408,000. So what that does for me, or what that suggests for me straight away, is that half of the SMSF members in the entire industry are potentially entitled to the carry forward catch-up contributions, or the catch-up concessional contributions. And I think, Jenna, did we have a question about the concessional catch-up?
Yes, Tim, we certainly did. So the question is, how do the catch-up concessional contributions, the calculations, how do they work?
Yeah, okay. So again, it's a little bit of, and I haven't got necessarily an example here to show you of that, but the way that it applies is it's a 5-year rolling amount. So the actual measure came in from the 1st of July 2018. The first year that we could actually use the measure was the 2019 year, so from 1 July 2019. And what it effectively meant was, for those people that were, or that make concessional contributions, whatever they haven't used, they can move into the next year. So when we talk about the concept of concessional contribution caps, and when we talk about indexing concessional contribution caps, excess concessional contributions charges are applied to a point in time, or at a point in time where you exceed your cap. But if you have a balance less than $500,000, a total superannuation balance less than $500,000, then what happens is what you haven't used from your concessional cap carries forward and adds on to the next year's cap. And so the ATO effectively do a recalculation of your cap, and you can max out that amount subject to what you haven't used in the previous year. But what it means is it also carries forward for up to 5 years. So you've got this capacity to keep carrying forward the unused amount for a rolling 5-year period, at which point they drop off. And an interesting note that I would make, and I kind of make this note when we look at the caps, and we look at 25,000, we look at 100,000, and we look at the median SMSF balance of 408,000. You know, it reminds me, I spent 4.5 years running my own business, and so the very essence of the sole trader and those operating through family trusts or whatever, you know, they are a bit of a backbone of the SMSF industry. And to give you a bit of enlightenment as to how much I contributed to my self-managed super fund, that number also had a 0 in it, but it was the only number that was relevant to my contribution caps for that 4 or 5 years. And I think that's why some of these strategies that I'm about to go through and talk about become really relevant, is because a lot of small business operators, as much as they want to put money into superannuation, you know, they're using the capital that they generate from their business to put back into the business. And so if we can start to look at this retirement age almost as a renaissance as to when to start making contributions again, you know, it opens up a whole new range of clients to us. Now, Jenna, did I see that we had another question come through? Oh yeah, that's just about the recording there. No worries. All right, yeah, the recording will be made available after the presentation for anyone that joined in late. So yeah, so look, from what I'm saying is that the way that these contributions strategies operate, you know, we shouldn't just be assuming that people are putting their caps in each year and making a benefit. So when we take that median balance and we look at those clients with under 300,000, which is going to be a significant number, well, all those clients are going to avail themselves to the recontribution strategy. Straight out, if we talk about somebody who has $408,000 of taxable benefits and they hit 65 years of age, well, then they have the capacity at 65 to access their super proceeds, assuming they work all the way up to 65. They can pull out $300,000, use the bring forward provision in the year of their 60th birthday, and under the assumption that we're going to have more money or longer time to make it up to 67, then we've effectively taken 3/4 of the super fund and taken it from being a taxable component and turned it into a tax-free component. So there's your estate planning benefits. I also look at the idea of partial CGT exemptions for downsizer contributions. So when we talk about the downsizer contribution in this exclusive environment, we're talking about the primary residence of the fund. But if we talk about an investment property where we have at some point in time lived in that property, then we're going to have a partial CGT exemption. And so post age 65, subject to our member balance, we can look at making a downsizer contribution, but also if we've ceased work, if we've got a CGT liability on the proceeds of that house, and we haven't used the catch-up concessional contributions, then again, we can marry those two strategies together to provide some form of opportunity for the clients to not only make a downsizer contribution, but to use potentially the work test exemption to be able to offset any additional capital gains tax that might have applied to that investment property previously. Obviously, we've got the 3-year bring forward opportunity for the clients, and this will be the big one once the legislation passes, and that is that if somebody is in their 67th year, then we can effectively go, right, well, if you cease work in the year that they turn 66, then the next year, right, if they've got less than that $300,000, then they can conceivably make a larger contribution. And again, if we're talking about a 67-year-old, what we're talking about with downsizer and bring forward is a capacity to take a fund that's sitting at less than $300,000 and turn it into something that's closer to $1 million self-managed superannuation fund. So did we have did another question just shoot up there, Jenna?
We certainly did, Tim. So from an ATO perspective, what is the purpose of taking the $300,000 out and recontributing?
So look, the ATO perspective, that's actually a really good question. And being in the industry as long as I have, too often I reference how long I've been in the industry, but the recontribution strategy has always been sort of one of those areas that occasionally gets a bit of a black mark next to its name, but I see it as a superannuation survivor. That's possibly the lamest thing I've ever said in a presentation, but I see it from a strategic point of view as one of those strategies that the ATO have never quashed it strategically. So ultimately, the ATO play line ball with Treasury and say that superannuation is not an estate planning vehicle, but they clearly recognise that superannuation can be used for estate planning purposes. Now, the concept of the recontribution strategy, it really only raised the ire of the ATO pre-2007 when we had pre-83 components and post-83 components, and people used to manipulate their superannuation benefits by offsetting or using the pre-83 period with non-concessional or undeducted back then to wash out their post-83. Now that we live in a world where it's purely just taxable or tax-free, and the taxable is all taxed at the same rate versus how pre and post-83 used to work, you know, it's really gone silent in that space. So from a commissioner point of view, there's nothing legislatively wrong with taking your taxable component and pulling it out legitimately from the superannuation fund and putting it back in as a non-concessional amount, because if we follow the strand that the purpose of super is to provide for our retirement, then all I'm doing is paying that money out of my own benefit as a tax-free amount over time. So if by chance I happen to pass away and therefore the benefit is paid to my non-tax dependents, such as my adult son when he reaches that age, then so be it. But again, those that know me well will understand that the amount of money I would like to leave him versus the amount of money that I want to spend myself is a fairly big difference there. So, you know, the whole concept of the recontribution strategy has never ever been sort of dissed by the ATO. It still exists and is available for us. So when we start to bring in the 3-year bring forward, when we start to contemplate the downsizer, and for me, when we start to contemplate the CGT small business contributions, we start to create contribution strategies for our clients that can lead us into fairly significant areas. And you'll see there that I've talked about, and I've excluded the CGT amount, but the 630 is ultimately a reference of, okay, downsizer at 300,000, bring forward non-concessional of 330, then a potential 5-year cap, and that's just making it at 25,000, not even contemplating 27,500 of 125,000 plus. We are talking about significant benefits that our clients are able to start to put into super prior to turning 68 or turning 67 as such. So look, I wanted to start to work through, as I said, an example that contemplates a number of these particular issues, but gives us the ability to start to think through how we can operate with regards to our clients and what their opportunities are. And I don't think that this is really too unrealistic with regards to how funds tend to operate. And I think the other thing about it is that there is definitely a lack of understanding or appreciation for the CGT small business exemptions and how they operate in the SMSF space. And whilst that is effectively a presentation in itself, how they work, you know, there clearly are for small business operators lots of opportunities. And again, if I go back and I reference the industry back from the late 90s into the evolution of self-managed superannuation funds, what we saw back in 98, 99 was a sea change with business real property. And so from a business real property point of view, we saw this capacity for self-managed super funds to go from being able to own 40% of business real property in a self-managed super fund up to 100% of business real property. So then we saw, with unlimited non-concessional or undeducted contributions, a lot of people use that to transfer business real property into self-managed super fund. Subsequently, 2007 changes, we saw the contribution caps come in, and the contribution caps took away that capacity outside of the bring forward rules to make large lumpy contributions to super, and we in effect got restricted to contemplating things like unit trusts and 1322C investments or limited recourse borrowing arrangements if we wanted to bring property in. But I guess for me, for a lot of small business owners and contemplating, say, the $6 million asset threshold and those sorts of areas, the key for me is that maybe it's not necessarily about bringing the business real property into the superannuation fund, but ultimately, if you can't bring it in or can't bring all of it in, then looking at using the future sale of that asset as a way to make your contribution at a later point in time into the superannuation environment. Now, a lot of people say, okay, well, that's not necessarily tax effective because the income that the property earns outside of super is going to be taxed at a potentially higher rate. And yes, whilst that's correct, you know, you've still got to contemplate, well, what are the other issues? What's the stamp duty obligations of transferring that property and what other costs might be associated and linked with it? So it will be problematic. So if we look at Susan and Patrick, and they're recently retired small business operators, so they're both aged 66 years of age. They've got a business premises which is valued at $4 million. Now in this instance, the gain is $2 million. They've owned it for 20 years. I will touch on the concept of them not having that 20-year ownership as well, but if we assume they've owned it for longer than 15 years, then that's going to qualify them for different CGT concessions. They both had $250,000 in super, which is all taxable at 30 June 2020. So again, if we use the Tim Miller small business model of making contributions into a fund, it's not unrealistic to think that small business operators, you know, potentially are making concessional contributions to offset some tax as they go, but clearly a lot of them are not making large non-concessional contributions along the sort of accumulation journey. So it wouldn't be unrealistic to have these funds of Susan and Patrick sitting there, $500,000 sitting in their self-managed superannuation fund. So we look at the CGT cap for this year, and we recognise that because this is an active asset, the property is an active asset of the business. They've continuously owned the asset for 15 years or longer than 15 years. Then each of Susan and Patrick are eligible to contribute up to $1.565 million under the CGT cap. So now we're talking about indexation that applies every year. Every year the CGT cap is an indexed amount. So we've got that $1.565 million, which ultimately means in this instance, of the $4 million proceeds, and this is the beauty of the 15-year rule, of that $4 million proceeds, $3.1 million of that can be placed into superannuation. Now again, we can look at that and go, $3.1 million, on top of 250,000, that's going to push them, up and around the transfer balance cap from a pension point of view. So it might not be desirable to put all of it in if they just want to have the up to the 1.6 each. But again, if we start to target 1.7, then that's looking closer to the full cap plus the 250,000. But also, given that our proceeds are at $4 million, we've got the capacity to utilise the $300,000 work test exemption. So they're recently retired. So if they retired in the previous year and the proceeds, the sale of the small business has taken a little bit of time and crosses financial years, then we can actually make those contributions and use the work test exemption to make the contribution in their 67th year. And again, on the assumption that the bring forward rules change, we can utilise the full non-concessional bring forward amount. So yeah, I'm triggering more than potentially what some clients might want to look at as far as the 3.2 million or 3.4 million from a transfer balance cap point of view. But we're saying here's a capacity to put an amount into superannuation and to have that sitting in there in a potentially tax-friendly environment. And given that of that 1.8, all 1.8 of it is going to be tax-free benefits, then from an estate planning point of view, we've created a fairly tax-effective situation for potentially Susan and Patrick's children in the event that they pass away. But the other thing, of course, from a point of view of what they can consider is, they have both satisfied a condition of release. So both Susan and Patrick are over 65 years of age. So the fact that they've had the capacity to make $25,000 contributions, potentially previously more than that before 2017, but because they've been making their taxable contributions, then they've got the capacity to look at pulling down their benefits, pulling out that 250,000 and then recontributing it. And I think this is where, for those that are strategically minded from a contribution point of view, we used to try and look at the timing of how contributions should work. So the way that the total super balance operates with these things, ultimately with this work test exemption applying, and particularly if you've got somebody in their 67th year, so the year they turn 67, if they cease work prior to 30 June and they pull down their balance, so if they pull out $250,000 of taxable benefits as at 30 June, well, their total super balance in the self-managed super fund is effectively zero. Right now, you're probably not going to take your fund all the way back to zero, but the total super balance is then going to be below the $300,000 amount. So it's one of those areas where, we can use the rules as they currently stand to our benefit to take taxable portions and turn them into tax-free portions. So I think we're starting to get a couple of questions through. Jenna, did you want to just read that first one out to me?
Certainly. So is 65 still a condition of release with nil cashing restrictions? Yeah,
look, that's a really good question, that one. All questions are good questions in the superannuation space, but it's a little bit of, without stealing the thunder of my last slide and where things are heading, right now, as it currently stands, there appears to be no desire, no expectation that 65 will change as far as our retirement age. However, the concept the concept behind this presentation is really about saying nothing ever stays the same in the super environment. Now, if you take the very simple situation of age pension has moved, and in some instances, particularly for women, has moved from age 60 and is approaching age 67. This introduction of the contribution rules was portrayed as aligning the contribution rules with the age pension rules. Now, the problem with portraying the contribution rules as to matching up with the age pension rules surely puts a level of fear in us that they're also going to link the access rules with the contribution and the age pension rules. And so right now, 65 is most definitely still a nil cashing restriction, just like 65 is still the trigger for downsides of contribution. But I don't think I could comfortably sit here and say that 65 will always be the condition of release for full access to super. It'd be lovely to say that that's absolutely the case, but just the way governments operate, you'd have to think that it'd be a long bow to take preservation age from 60 through to 67. But you know, let's not discount government's capacity to make a total mess of the superannuation rules as such. So I think that's you know, answered those questions there with regards to how the age testings work. So we could look at doing down that recontribution strategy, but similarly, if they'd owned their business property for less than 15 years, well, it might limit how much they can contribute to super, but they've still got the $500,000 CGT retirement exemption, and the retirement exemption can only apply to the gain. So in this instance, our gain is $2 million on this property. Now, you know, it might have just been that, you know, my thinking through when I put this strategy together was make your maths simple, Tim, to keep the presentation rolling. But in this instance, they would both be entitled to a 50% discount as individuals on the sale of the property. So that brings their gains down from $1 million to $500,000. Then they can use the $500,000 retirement exemption, and that would give them the capacity to make the contribution of $500,000 into the super fund. If we then took on board or on top of that the $300,000 non-concessional, we're limiting, or 330, depending on what the number, we're limiting the amount of the proceeds to about 800,000, but still a sizable chunk of proceeds can be put into super post age 67 in that event. And of course, you know, if we're playing with numbers and saying that the small business had other income that it was generating, they potentially had investment properties that they're selling down on, who knows how Susan and Patrick operated, but they'd also have the capacity then to make concessional catch-up contributions. So for me, you know, it's really a matter of identifying that there are a lot of different strategies that avail themselves now that the retirement age has moved from, or not the retirement age, sorry, the contribution age has moved from 65 to 67, and we should be looking at our clients who are small business operators and saying, okay, well, it might not be appropriate to transfer the property in, but you can look at the sell down strategies and make your contributions and enhance your pension benefits between the ages of 65 and 67. And for those that work that little bit longer, then they've still got that 100,000 or whatever the caps are indexed to post age 67. So whilst it would be nice legislatively for us to get the bring forward amount in alignment with that 67, and all expectation is that will apply. There was a bit of stuff in the Senate proposed by Pauline Hanson, or the Pauline Hanson One Nation Party, that referenced some various catch-up concessional contributions for different age groups, subject to being over the age of 65 to make up for COVID-19. There was some other measures with regards to not allowing early access recipients to contribute proceeds back into super. So, you know, there was a few things that probably warranted a few minutes of discussion in the Senate on these measures, but ultimately Labor have said they will support the bring forward changes. And given the government didn't move on freezing super guarantee from next year, I suspect that we'll see, now that the budget papers are starting to make their way through, I suspect that we'll see the bring forward rules come into effect soon. So I guess my final points that I want to raise is that from a strategy consideration point of view, and the concept of, you know, where do we sit with indexation, wait one more year and then use the bring forward provisions if they're 330,000? Should we wait 2 years and wait until our balance is higher and therefore we can put more into super with a higher transfer balance cap? I guess that I would always come back to is there are great opportunities available now, right? And so there are always opportunities available to you. And yes, you can take risks, right? And I think the great example of that was, or maybe not great example, but the examples that we saw back in 2006-07 with the $1 million cap, and people that were concerned about how much to put in. So if they put in a little bit more, or then they were able to just pull out when the government brought back the rules. People that responded to the $500,000 non-concessional lifetime limit and responded by thinking, I've got too much, I can't make a contribution, right, instead of waiting for the law, well, they lost their opportunity to contribute. So I think it's really important to know what is the current law and to work within those parameters. And for the potential sake of, say, $30,000 in bring forward contributions, you may end up missing out on $100,000 worth of non-concessional because there is a spike in the market movements and the fund valuations take you to a point where you're no longer qualifying for various parts of the bring forward or even the non-concessional contributions. There's also the inherent risk of future budget restrictions. So, don't ever put it past the government to introduce restrictive measures from a contribution point of view. We only have to look at and what that means in the transfer balance caps, and the fact that we've got all of these caps that effectively replaced a single benefit cap, which was reasonable benefit limits in the previous iteration of superannuation. We're now being capped on the way in and on the way out in sense of super, and so that in itself can be relatively problematic. The other thing that I really want to, I guess, finish on from a point of view of contributions is an understanding, particularly with this 67 increase, is that there is a difference between mistakes and inability to make contributions, and a lot of self-managed super fund trustees make what they believe to be contribution mistakes. So they might make a non-concessional contribution when they've got more than $1.6 million in super, or they might make a concessional contribution and that concessional contribution isn't eligible for a deduction for whatever purpose. They might not have enough income to claim the full amount, and so the excess is going to be treated as a non-concessional. And so it puts them over the non-concessional cap. In those sorts of situations, the client is effectively in excess of the non-concessional cap and has to go through the excess contribution process. And so what that really means is it's going to be a refund through the ATO, it's going to be associated earnings, and there are going to be time frames to contemplate there, versus those clients who are over 67 now. So this is our old school 65-year-olds, those that are over 67 and don't qualify for the work test exemption. So if somebody is over 67, doesn't meet the work test and didn't have $300,000 or less than $300,000 the previous year, they are not entitled to contribute to superannuation. And so if they make a contribution, it's not a contribution and it must be returned to the fund, or sorry, to the member within 30 days of that contribution being made, or being made aware of that contribution. Now, inevitably, that 30 days is triggered the day that it goes in, because SMSF trustees should know what they're doing. We all know the realities of that often they don't know that they shouldn't have put it in until a later date. Now, that becomes an audit issue from a regulatory breach, but the rectification is to pull that money out and then report the breach as rectified. So if they're not entitled to put money in under the SIS regs, then the money must come out. And we're seeing a little bit of that now, particularly with COVID-19 and people on JobKeeper and other sorts of things, just trying to work out whether or not they're entitled to contribute. And my sort of go-to with a lot of these clients is, well, if you're over 67 and you were working and you want to make a personal contribution, well, make it. Because if you can't make it, then the ramifications are, because you're on JobKeeper or something else, the ramifications are that you weren't entitled to make it and you can pull it out. So I think you can always start to think through those sorts of issues. So look, that was, again, a bit of a fly through of a lot of the contribution strategies or concepts that I want people to be able to think about, and to recognise that the bring forward rules will create some issues for our clients, but also lower balances will create opportunities. And so 65 to 67 gives us those opportunities. We need to be really vigilant in what our balances are. We need to look at ways, if possible, of through appropriate valuations, through incorporating future income tax benefits or deferred tax liabilities, look at ways of potentially bringing down member balances to avail clients to the various total super balance opportunities. So all these sorts of things sort of play out in the superannuation contribution space, and all we need is that final green light on the bring forward, and that just makes all of the contribution opportunities endless. So if I can just check, have we received any more questions there, Jenna?
No, I think we're good.
Okay.